Hello and welcome to this video about what we've been doing in humanities so far. And I'm going to start with a joke that one of my 9Y kids came up with actually. And it's quite laughable, it's something quite small, and it's something quite ancient. And it is this. There we go. It is the 99 ringgit Nokia, something so strong you can throw it at a wall and the wall will come down. And the reason I'm using this is because when we're looking at Russia before Peter the Great, Russia was basically seen as this Nokia is today. There's no way anybody can say that this phone here is the height of technology when you have the likes of this phone here. And this phone resembles the likes of Britain, France and Italy. And this phone here represents Russia. So if we look at Russia, and if you Google an image of Russia, and the one that we looked at in class, you will see that it spans a huge geographical area. And within that area, you have Europeans, you have Muslims, and you have Asians. And in that area, you have such, multiculturalism happening right there. You have a mix of cultures and traditions all within one border type thing. And it's a huge border. And therefore, it was quite difficult for Russia to kind of say what its identity actually was, because you have all of these traditions and these cultures within the same area. And this therefore meant that Russia wasn't really able to have a strong identity as other countries at that point in time. Another major factor in Russia being seen as this phone here was that Europe had gone through the Renaissance period, which was a huge cultural period in time in Europe, which started off in Italy and then through trade spread to the likes of France, to Germany and to England, but not to Russia. And Russia at the time was still a very agricultural based country, and that you had a very hierarchical structure. And therefore, because most of the produce that they made was to do with farming, then there's not a lot of money in that. And again, as you have with France, you have, major states within Russia whereby noblemen are very powerful and they all have their own armies and they all are able to collect their own taxes, which means that you have within the same country potentially different armies fighting over each other and also building up their own armies and wealth. And therefore, there's no real leadership happening in Russia at that time. And therefore, that's why if you remember EPTC, that Russia, economically, politically, technologically, and culturally, was seen as the 99 ringgit Nokia. So, what you have in Russia is a mix of different peoples. And I suppose you could equally compare that to Malaysia, where you have the three main races of Malays, the Indians, and the Chinese, all living in one country, and that's unique to Malaysia. And again, it's an example of a multicultural country. But if you go out and read the news, and you read different news stories, you will hear and you will read different things which talks about the complexities that some people face living in Malaysia. And we'll just leave that there. And so Peter the Great wasn't very happy, wasn't very pleased with how Russia was developing. So he went on a sort of massive, European tour to the likes of France, to Holland, or the Netherlands as it was called then, and also to Great Britain. And he saw what he liked and he took what he liked back to Russia. And this included research on navies. This included research on culture, and also hired skilled workers from Europe and brought them back to Russia to replicate and to make even more magnificent and fantastic buildings than that he had seen in Europe. And part of his westernization of Russia were things like this. No long beards were allowed, only short beards or no beards at all. So I'd be okay in Russia. They had to use cutlery when they ate their food. The noblemen could only wear European-style clothes from the likes of Italy or France, and that when the nobles met, there was no one-me-to-rule business. They were allowed to dance and to talk to each other and to socialize, and that would also in turn help improve the social and cultural development of Russia. And in terms of his achievements, what did Peter the Great actually do other than tell people to cut their beards short? Well, in his 43 years in power, he basically looked at France and basically replicated it. It's sort of, Command C, Command V. Okay? Complete copy and paste from France over to Russia. And therefore, he made sure that he was also an absolutist ruler, and made sure that he was able to control the politics, was able to control the tax system, and was able to control the army. And furthermore, his other achievements is that he managed to implement reforms to the education system in Russia, the transport system in Russia. He developed their industry so that they were more economically competitive, and he expanded the military. And he made 5% of all Russians join the military for life. He modified the government, which was, copying France's centralization. He increased Russia's territory through war with the likes of the Ottoman Empire and with Sweden. And he moved the capital city from Moscow to a new place called St. Petersburg, which was named after Peter the Great. And he built a wonderful palace over there to rival the Palace of Versailles in France. And pretty much the reason that the Palace of Versailles was built was so that the King of France, King Louis XIV, could prove that he had power and use it as a symbol of his wealth and of France's wealth. And therefore Peter the Great did exactly the same thing. However, if you're looking at the short-term impact on society or the long-term impact in society, then you also need to look at the disadvantages of Peter the Great's rule. And one of the disadvantages that in Russia, the leaders, which obviously is Peter the Great, was not answerable by any law, which therefore means he was more powerful than King Louis XIV or any absolutist ruler of that same time period, because King Louis XIV ended up getting beheaded. He lost his head. But not Peter the Great. And he was not able to be overthrown as quickly or in the same fashion as the revolution in France. His actions, pretty similar to King Louis. He humiliated, imprisoned, tortured, and put people under forced labor. And this would have caused a certain amount of social unrest. Now, his biggest enemies, or his biggest constraining factor in Russia, were the nobles, because he'd taken away a lot of their power. They no longer had their own armies, they no longer collected their own taxes, so he had to give them something back. And he introduced the serfdom, S-E-R-F-D-O-M, where nobles could keep serfs, which would be a group of people that pretty much were treated like slaves. And he also brought the Orthodox religion under the control of the state. So again, what you're beginning to see, and what is being copied again completely from France, is that all of these separate elements of the country, the power to make decisions, the executive, the judiciary, the legislature body, and the central tax system, and the military, and now religion, all brought under the control of one man, Peter the Great. And therefore, this enables him to build up his power and to maintain his power, because if anybody disagreed with him, then they get killed. So, what do? You agree with what your leader is telling you to do. And therefore, St. Peter the Great was able to rule Russia for 43 years. And if you look back to what Russia was like before Peter the Great, then you could argue that his policy of westernization was kind of successful. And yes, people weren't happy, and this caused some social unrest. Therefore, this disrupted the balance. But in terms of was Peter the Great successful? Yes. And if you look at Russia now, we've looked at in class the 9 Whys. We looked at the Syria debate for the MUN thing, and even in the press, you have America and Russia historically against each other, and for certain conflicts in Europe, Russia has sometimes fought against Europe. The other European countries, against France, Britain and Germany, or being on the other side. And it's quite interesting that when you see that, they once had a leader that wanted to westernize Russia, take the best of Europe and take it into Russia, and then you see in the long term is that there are still, disagreements internationally between Russia and the West. And this was one of the main reasons for the Cold War in after 1945 and the Iron Curtain and everything else like that. And therefore that is a long-term impact, a long-term impact, which has got lots of different events which have happened in its place, but it's nonetheless can still be connected back if you plot the time. Okay? So that is Peter the Great. He wanted to westernize Russia. He succeeded in that aim. He was a very powerful absolutist ruler, more powerful than King Louis XIV. And that brings to an end this video. Thank you very much for watching. Good night.